I think given that we have limited time, I'm just going to make a very quick remark maybe to wrap up and then open the floor for questions. I think as a final kind of note from my end here, having listened to these interesting presentations, is looking back to the sort of the how necessary is the political component. How necessary is there to have, and what is that political horizon? What's the sort of minimum that you need in order to be able to carry out these kinds of activities and to build these kinds of this kind of fund? And interestingly, looking back on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and how this issue was addressed in past negotiations, and I just want to make this kind of quick anecdote in the sense that in, let's say, the Annapolis negotiations, there actually were committees that discussed culture of peace, as it was called, and they had probably one of the few negotiating exercises that yielded an agreed text. So you actually have an agreement on this culture of peace, and you actually have one of the draft articles that both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians, call for the creation of a coexistence fund, and actually refer to in the brackets, refer to Northern Ireland. They actually went on a trip to Northern Ireland to look into it back in 2008. And you actually had one of the most sort of, and the end of this anecdote is, none of the politicians really cared about what this committee did. It wasn't really something that people took note of, because it wasn't Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, etc. But I think the lesson from that is, I think a couple of things. One is that you can actually get far on this stuff, very far in the right political context. If people see that things are moving towards what they identify as their major political objectives, a lot of this stuff can happen and much faster than we think. And that's why I'm also a bit optimistic about how quickly things can change under the right political context. So I kind of mentioned, is it absolutely necessary? In the absence of any kind of political progress or diplomatic process, is there still something we should be doing?
Can I respond to that? Yeah, so I think one of the things that was sort of uplifting, but also in the end depressing during the last negotiations, was exactly that point, that when you have a positive horizon, there is more room. And we had civil society organizations knocking at our door constantly saying, how can we help? And some of them may be sitting up here, but on the one hand, there was a lot more interest among all of the U.S. government as well as other governments to do something, and recognizing that civil society is there, they can help us, they can be on the ground, speaking for this. But at the same time, there was literally not a dollar dedicated to this effort. And so, one of the things I did was compile all these requests and all the proposals to say, okay, once we get the funding, this is what we're going to do. But we never got the funding because we never got an agreement. And so I think one of the things that we need to think through is, how do you kind of get that funding or make it there, recognizing that just because there's not negotiations doesn't mean there's not a need for this same sort of work to happen.
And I think it's this chicken and egg dynamic that you so aptly framed, right? The idea that, yes, the necessary and sufficient, and it applies to both sides. Neither is sufficient. They are both necessary and need to work in coordination with each other. And it's going to be very hard for publics to push their leaders towards taking these risks if they don't have the investment.
I'll just add in, it's interesting because if you ask Israelis on the ground what the biggest problem is, they'll talk about incitement, which is fundamentally a culture of peace issue, right? And the parties bat around this concept of the trilateral commission so that they can all point at each other saying, you incited me here, now the Americans have to play referee and hit you on the head and hit you on the head. The point being, it is a recognized issue that the next generation is being lost. It is recognized by the populations themselves, and in the honest moments, Israelis will tell you there is also an issue in Israel, that if you stay under a situation of conflict for long enough, your populations bubble up with racial tensions. And the Palestinians in an honest moment will tell you, yes, it's very difficult to condemn martyrdom, because if someone has martyred themselves in a terrorist attack, it's very difficult for us to then go and criticize the families after that fact when they've given them their lives up for the homeland. And so there is a stark recognition of this, but yet at the same time, incitement has become a political football. And so again, we have to wait until there's the political will to agree where there is no will, while the situation continues to deteriorate. And once again, just drawing it back to the first panel, it wasn't easy for supporters of island in Congress to stand up, I'm sure, in 1985 and 1986 and saying, yes, we're going to do something that honestly felt like working with the enemy at that point, or for members of the Commonwealth. And if there is this agreed culture of text, culture of peace text, even if the parties themselves can't right now stand up and say, we agree, if, for example, there was an international actor who was trying to get to an ultimate peace deal between the Israelis and Palestinians and felt that their legislators felt that incitement was a really problematic, if they potentially could release text that they knew the parties actually agreed with, and that founded a new Anglo-Irish agreement that something like this could be based on, I think you could start actually draining the swamp that exists in that part of the world, even if it's a start, you know, and something that we should really look towards.
And I think you have implementing partners who are ready to do that. I mean, I hear about incitement all the time. There's tons of organizations working to create the opposite of incitement, recognition of the legitimacy of the other side, the homeland of both peoples. All of these things are there, ready to go. So if you care about incitement, let's do something about incitement. If you care about equality for Palestinians in our community, it's a lot about equality. In Jerusalem, how do we get municipal services to be equal between East and West? If we could make progress on that issue and see that grassroots nonviolent joint activism made a difference in people's lives, that then gives you momentum to take it to the next level. It's building this momentum, getting past the starting line, I think, is the challenge.
Can I just have one more thing on that to connect the civil society and the policy piece and try to wrestle with this chicken and egg situation? One of my favorite polls to cite in this, and it's sort of been replicated in many other studies, but when you look at the dynamics that Sarah pointed out in terms of the challenges with anti-normalization and the legislation in Israel, what that's doing to put a damper on civil society, which is what's going to be needed to overcome the deep mutual distrust. There was a poll that was done by University of Maryland. It was Stephen Cole and Shibli Telhami in the 2014, with which it's not my favorite poll because USIP partnered on it, but we happened to partner on it at the time. But one of the findings, he went through the different components, they went through the different components of a package deal, a political deal, and polled Israelis and Palestinians, trying, seeing who would sign on to what component and then the whole package. And the bottom line to me, the sort of punchiest headline or the biggest takeaway from this poll was that for those who would not sign on to the poll, when they were polled again and said, okay, the other side has signed on to it, now what do you think? Those numbers went up on both sides. So the idea being that public opinion, is dynamic and can be shifted, and so much of that shift comes with belief that the other side is operating in good faith and that success is possible. And so if you think about all the levels of coordination that have to happen there in order to put that in place, but what that means is civil society work has a huge role to play, because that's where this trust building happens, and what happens when you see crowds of people out in the street arguing for something better, arguing for a shared vision, as we heard about in the first panel. So